I think one of the questions that I get asked the most is how do I balance my kick and bass? And obviously there's related questions to that. How do I create a good kick? How do I create a good bass in the first place? How do I push them together? And also more general questions like how do I nail the low end? And as you can imagine, I can give you a whole bunch of different small tips on that. I can sit here and EQ 1,000 different bass lines if I wanted to, but at the end of the day, that's not really going to teach you anything. So today I want to talk a little bit more about just learning these kind of things, a little bit more about the boring part. But I will promise that I'll throw in a couple of tricks to keep you awake. So we're going to do that at the end of this project over here. So you can hear nice kick and bass, it just sounds good to me. It is nothing too special to me yet, and this project isn't currently mixed, but that doesn't really matter for what I'm going to be talking about today. The very first thing that I should probably talk about is what inspired this particular project. And really what happened was I heard this kind of style a little bit more on WoW Festival, just this more darker, a little bit more aggressive style of Psytrance than what I normally write. And after having moved to this apartment and having settled a bit, I gave it a go and I spent a lot of time working on this project in one go. And this was one of those projects where really all of the inspiration just kind of flew out of me like naturally. And that kind of included the kick and bass. So when we look at the kick and bass, I'm just quickly going to go through the batch because I know that you guys like that. This is actually an audio render of this kick pad over here. So this is the kick. It's just a simple audio jack kick drum. I believe the track is muted so we can hear it like this. This is the kick drum. You can, honestly, if you want, you can copy the settings, but I wouldn't do that because as I'm going to explain later, that doesn't really matter, the exact settings that I'm using. The only track where the audio render is, as you can see, I'm doing a little bit more EQing. This is just so that I have a little bit of EQing on there, which is not captured in any kick drum that is responsible for the fills. So if we zoom out, we can see that there's a whole bunch of extra kicks in these tracks over here. By the way, I changed my skin up a little bit. Turns out I have a slightly brighter version of the skin that I normally use. I am a big fan of dark mode, but not a lot of people are, especially when it comes to YouTube content. And I have gotten some comments of people that were actually annoyed with the skin that I was using. So hopefully this is at least a little bit better without being too bright for what I personally like. Anyway, that means that we have our main kick, which has a little bit of an extra power to the transient, mainly because of this EQ over here. And it's just getting a little bit of extra punch from this one. One of the things that I personally like to do when it comes to EQing is I like to break it up in stages. So when I'm later on going back into it, it is pretty clear what each of the EQs is doing. And potentially, if I wanted to, I could turn off and on different EQs to just hear different effects that I'm trying to do. It also means that I did this EQ first over here. And then later on, somewhere in the production, I decided to come back into this kick and do this EQ again. So it's another nice indication of that I actually did this thing twice. And then all of those kicks, the fill kicks and the main ones, go into this track over here. There's a little bit more processing on here. As you can see, there's a lot more EQing and whatnot. We have another line of EQing. This is on all of the kick drums, of course. We have my transition rack. So this is doing high pass filtering, low pass filtering. And you can see I'm also using Q automations on this one. We have a basic volume automation here. We have this rack, which is responsible for certain transitions. If we just quickly check where it turns on, it is happening in the fills. So over here, for example. After that, we have another volume control. Again, what you'll see is that I'm stacking ideas on top of each other. I don't like going into multiple different processes and using them for multiple different things. So this was a very specific idea that I wanted to do in the intro, where the kick drum just becomes a little bit quieter in its build up here. And after that, you can see another EQ, Shadow Hill's mastering compressor. Again, if you want to copy over the settings, you can do that, but that doesn't really matter. All that you need to know with these kind of plugins is that I just sometimes throw them on there to experiment. And because I was doing a little bit of a new style, this was one of those cases where it would be really nice to just experiment a little. Same is true with this last plugin over here. Again, there was an EQ in between there. And in this case, I'm using the Distressor. This one is by UAD. And it's also a very good compression plugin that I just wanted to test out to see what it would do on kick drums. Honestly, again, I could probably go through, say, part of this processing and turn it off so that you can hear differences if you really want to. It doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, you're probably not trying to get this exact kick drum. At the end of the day, what you would want is a system that allows you to make the kick drums that you want for your track. One of the things that I sometimes see, which often annoys me a little bit, is when Mainly beginners say that, okay, I have done this thing, I want to achieve this thing, so I use this tutorial and I just copied over the tutorial. I kind of want to prevent that as much as possible with my own content, because I don't think that that's really how you learn things. What it really means to learn something like getting a right kick and bass is to set up a system that kind of automatically pushes you to creating a kick and bass that works well. And I think a lot of producers kind of make the mistake where they focus a little bit too much on trying to find that one trick that is magically going to turn their bad kick and bass into a great kick and bass, and less on the slow incremental gains that you need to make in order to actually get there. Because at the end of the day, it is a long learning process that should involve a lot of time, because when you want to be able to hear the details that you need to hear in order to make a good kick and bass, you need to train your ears a lot. I've talked about this many times on my channel before, but what I always recommend is that every time that you go into the studio, you spend your first half hour at least listening to other people's music, just to get your ears in tune a little bit, and then you start working on your own productions. For me, that's a little bit more effective than actually having a reference track in the project. And in fact, if I scroll up here to where I have an area for reference tracks, you can see that I don't have one loaded. And that is very much by design. I don't like going into a reference track and really hearing the big differences between what I'm doing and what the reference track is trying to do. Or actually the other way around, what I'm trying to do and what the reference track is already doing. But either way, what I like much more is the idea that I'm kind of tuning my ears with all of the music that I listen to. And then when I get into my own stuff, I get to make the decisions that allow me to kind of get an average of all of that. I'm a little bit inspired by what this track is doing. I'm a little bit inspired by what that track is doing. So when it comes to learning and referencing and all of that stuff, I much prefer the long haul game, where just over time, by listening to more and more music, you kind of naturally tune your ears to what music is supposed to sound like. Of course, then there's the other parts of learning the tools, and that is where what I showed before with just the kick drum is very interesting, where I just sometimes open up a plugin and experiment a little bit. When it comes to experimentation though, one of the things that I want to warn against, and which I also warned against in another video, which did a little bit poorly, but I'll forgive you guys. Honestly, it was not the best title, so I'll recap a little bit here. One of the things that you need to be careful with is that you don't experiment to the point where the experimentation becomes unusable. And one of the tools that is very handy in there is something like Psyscope that just shows you the waveform. Something like Psyscope allows you to not just rely on your ears, which is really handy when you don't know what you're doing yet, because the visual representation of a kick and bass is going to look one way, and that allows you to kind of match the visual side and then hear what is happening for the actual sound of the kick and bass. The other thing when it comes to learning your tools is that there's a lot of content available, and you should probably use all of the content rather than just one tutorial. What I mean by that is, as I hinted at before, I see so many people that just follow a tutorial and do that step by step, rather than trying to maybe watch a few tutorials, see some of the commonalities between them, and then try to conclude what the best approach is for them, for their workflow, in order to get the characteristics that all of the tutorials are trying to get out of their bassline, for example. I know there's a million different kick and bass tutorials out there. I know there's also a million different specifically for bass tutorials out there, because basses tend to be a little bit more difficult than kicks. Of course, I've made a massive guide on kick and bass as well, but I've also done other tutorials on it because I'm also continuously learning more stuff. In this case, there's some really cool things going on in this bass line, but actually the main bass is just provided by one of my presets. I believe I just modified the macros over here, nothing more. By the way, this pack is currently on sale, so if you want it, go get it on my Gumroad or my Payhip page, where you'll find that all of my products actually have a 30% discount up until the end of the year. In this case, my next step was to actually volume balance it. And then we have a little bit of processing with M stereo spread to get a little bit of a wider sound. And then here I have transgressor, which is doing transient versus sustain EQing. In this case, there was a really annoying humming frequency in this area over here, which I wanted to deal with a little bit separately in the actual hum of the sound, as opposed to just the transient. I've noticed that if I just EQ this part out, like I'm doing in the sustain here from the transient, that then the transient would lack a lot of the punch that I wanted. And given that I have this tool that I know that really does this stuff really well, which is EQing differently between the sustain part of a sound and the transient part of a sound, that is then why I made the decision to do this approach over here. Now, maybe a good thing to say about that is, just because I use that approach here, just because I solve this problem this way, doesn't mean that it's the best approach. Like I hinted to before, again, with that like watching of multiple tutorials and the whole spiel that I've been going on about, is really that you are trying to find your own workflow. I actually currently have a student that is struggling a lot with this. Most of the questions that I get from him is, which product do I buy in order to do this? Which product do I buy in order to do that? And I always have to respond with, you don't buy a product, you learn how to do that. Of course, you can probably buy a sample pack with a bunch of good kicks and a bunch of good basses and make a couple of nice tracks out of that. But one, I think your experience with music production is going to become really, really boring. And two, you're going to be frustrated because you lack both the experience to make changes to it and just the ability to make changes to it because you're relying on a sample as opposed to something like a preset. And even if you buy a preset, you don't know how to use the synth that you're loading the preset into, then you're not going to be able to make the changes that you want to make to the sound. So again, these processes are interesting and the exact plugins that I use may be interesting as well, but that really shouldn't be the interesting part. What should be the interesting part for you is, okay, how does he detect the problem? How does he find a solution to that problem? And how can I implement something similar into my own workflow? Anyway, again, for the curious, what we'll have is a little bit more EQing. And then we can see M transient MB over here, which I'm using for high frequency phasing. I believe I also made a video on this, at least it may be one topic in a multi-topic video or something like that, something about the details of a bassline if I remember correctly. I'm also using M freeform phase, which this is a process that I've never done. It seems that I'm adjusting the phase a little bit in the lower mids mainly. Then finally we again have that same rack of transitions that we saw on the kick drum and a final multiband compressor over here, which is again carving out the higher frequencies a little bit more. And all of that is in combination with this layer over here, which as you can see is just a really high-pitched top click here, which I've added a little bit of dimension expander to, and then just EQ'd so that it's only active in the highest frequencies. And finally, we're volume shaping that with LFO tool. Now, you may have noticed in that explanation that there was a couple of times that I was a little bit surprised at what I was doing myself. Like I've made this kick and bass 2 months ago, and there's processes in there that I'm just questioning, like, what am I doing there? Why am I doing it that way? And really, that is kind of the next thing that I should address. When it comes to those processes where I'm just like in the flow of creating the kick and bass, I am at the point where I feel like I always get a decent kick and bass without really getting anything special. And therefore, whenever I do want something special, I just experiment a little bit and I stray away from my normal workflow from kick and bass a little bit, where I just experiment with this plugin, which I know how it works, I know what it does, like M freeform phase, for example. I've used that plugin hundreds of times for different purposes, but never for this specific purpose. And therefore I experimented a little bit with what this particular plugin would do. Now, one of the reasons why I like Psyscope so much, or any monitoring tool like this one, is that you can always check the cleanliness of your kick and bass. That is usually defined of how much space is left over for each of the elements of the kick and bass. And normally what we want is we want the maximum amount of space possible. What we can see over here is that there's a little bit of like movement right before the bassline triggers. So you can see where the bassline triggers over here. And you can see that it's slightly being pushed away from where the silence would be, which means that technically speaking, this kick and bass isn't clean. But in this case, I would say that we are so close to a clean kick and bass that this will pass. Of course, that is provided that I don't put like a high pass on the master or something stupid like that, where I'm just going to introduce massive amount of phase shift and I'm going to destroy all of the transient over here, and over here, with the stuff that is sitting now before it actually being shifted backwards in phase and bleeding into this part over here. So whenever I'm experimenting, 9 out of 10 times I do have Psyscope open, again, just to look at the bassline while I'm experimenting, not just to see, okay, if I apply this process, my bassline will start from looking like this into looking like this, which is a way that you can learn your tools, right? If I want my bassline going from this to looking like that, and that means that the sound is going from this to sounding like that, that means that I can use this plugin, that means that I can use that process, that means that I can do whatever I need to do in order to get that. But it also helps me specifically judge the cleanliness, which is really important with translating onto other systems. And mainly the lack of punch that you sometimes hear from your kick and bass coming onto other systems is usually caused by the fact that the transient doesn't have enough space to exist in, specifically when you go into mastering. What tends to happen is if you have massive bleeding into here and this transient is being displaced out of the center, so it's either being pushed up in amplitude or it's being pushed down in amplitude into the negatives. What tends to happen is that the limiter is then going to add much more on the transient because it's going to be louder, like temporarily of course. This peak is just going to be much higher up in terms of peak level, but not really in loudness, in the sense that just because of a phase shift, the actual perceived loudness isn't going to change, just the peak loudness, like the peak level. And that means that the limiter is actually going to act on that peak level, therefore reducing the size of the transient and therefore just lowering the volume of the transient. Whereas if it's clean like this, where the transient has all of the space and it's kind of oscillating around the center, it's not being pushed up into the limiter, it's not being pushed down into the limiter, it's going to have enough space and therefore it will maintain more of its punch. Now again, with this kind of stuff, it's not really about just knowing that in a tutorial sake, it's getting the experience in order to get to a point where you're naturally working in this way. Because if I again go through all of these plugins, I've already studied what all of these plugins are going to mean in terms of phase shift, how I should use them in order to avoid any excessive phase shift. Going back into this M freeform phase, now that I think about it, what might actually be happening over here, which is an interesting idea, is that I'm applying negative phase shift. So I might be trying to roll back some of the phase shift that I'm getting from maybe this earlier EQs over here, which are doing some stuff in that lower mid-range and even in the lowest frequencies. And I think one of the reasons why I'm so comfortable, which this whole video boils down to, is I've done this many, many times. I just have the experience, right? And if you want to get to a point where your kick and bass is sounding like me, if you like what I do with my kick and bass, then you probably need a similar level of experience. Like we can have a good estimate over here. This is project number 110. That means that I've made at least 110 kick and basses for Psytrance. But I know for a fact that it's at least double than that because I've made so many tutorials, I've made so many presets, I've just experimented a lot of the time without actually saving the kick and bass that I ended up making. So I think it's fair to say that I've made a kick and bass for Psytrance probably over 250 times. If I really had to sit down and try to count them all, I think that I would get there. Now, if you want to take another artist, say somebody like Asterix, and you really like his kick and bass, he probably has done it even more times than that. He probably has done it maybe double the times that I have done it. I mean, there's artists around that have been making kick and bass since before I was born. So even for me, there's artists that I can look up to and I can say like, oh, they have so much more experience than me. They have so much more intuition than me. At the end of the day, your questions shouldn't be, okay, which tricks can I use in order to get my kick and bass to sound like that guy that has 20 years of experience? It is, how can I most quickly gather that 20 years of experience and maybe condense it down into 1 year? Some part of that is going to be watching tutorials. Some part of that is going to be experimenting. Some part of that is going to be actually writing and finishing a track. Some parts of that is going to a festival and just getting inspired by what other artists are doing there, what other kick and basses are sounding like in a festival setting, and then going back home and listening to them on your own system in order to see, are there any major differences in just the tonality of the kick and bass that I can hear that I'm maybe not able to account for when I'm just listening to stuff on only my system. And that is the reason why I ultimately cannot answer the question, how do I nail the kick and bass for you? It's because the answer to that will depend on how you want to do things. So that's going to be the takeaway of this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that that's helpful. I don't know if it is. Just saying that there is no track that you can magically use is maybe not the thing that you want to hear, but maybe you should hear it anyway. Either way, I am going to stop rambling now because it has been like 40 minutes and I don't know how much of this stuff is actually going to be usable in the edit. So thank you very much for watching. I hope that you did enjoy this content. Let me know if you did by leaving a like and make sure that you're subscribed. Another way to support the channel is by watching some more of my content. So I'll leave 2 videos up on the screen for you to choose from, together with the link to my Patreon. So if you want to support me financially, you can do that as well. But thank you for watching and bye-bye.